Hello and welcome to this lesson on specific reading comprehension question types, detail and purpose that you'll experience on the verbal section of the GMAT exam. So let's first talk about how frequently you will encounter these types of questions. The detail and purpose tasks are the most common reading comprehension tasks. You'll assume that 1 to 3 out of the 3 or 4 likely questions for a passage will be asking about a detail or a purpose. And it's possible for these tasks to address both specific and broad subjects, so a specific detail or a specific purpose of some sort of phrase within the passage, or just what is the primary purpose of the passage overall, for instance. The strategic implications of detail and purpose tasks is that if you've completed a full upfront read of the passage, you want to assume about 60 seconds per subsequent question, not just for detail and purpose tasks, but really for every subsequent question after that upfront read. If you're spending somewhere between 3 and possibly as many as 5 minutes, if you need to, on the upfront read of a reading comprehension passage, you just have to be prepared to go pretty quickly through the remaining questions. However, if you decided not to do the full upfront read, primarily because your first question for the passage was about a specific subject and probably was a specific detail or purpose question, then you can spend up to 2 minutes per question for every question on that passage, because you're basically going to be taking in the information as you go rather than spending the time upfront to read. And remember that the GMAT does reward flexibility in approach, so as much as you can, let the questions themselves dictate your approach. And primarily that first question, let it dictate whether you really need to read the passage in full. Now, you're going to want to restate the task relating to whatever the subject is in the form of a conventional what or why question. And the reason for this is just their phrasing is terrible. So you want to make sure that you can rearrange the information in a way that's more accessible. And the way that you need to consider this is just the difference between when something asks you what did it say and why did it say it. So if you've got a detail question, it is just asking you for the literal details. What was said in a paraphrase? But a purpose question is going to ask you why was this said, and you're often going to have trap answers that will answer the other question. So just consider this as a brief kind of overview of the difference between what was said and why was it said. If I were to ask you, what are you doing right now? You'd probably say watching a video. But if I were to ask you, the viewer, what is your purpose right now, you would not just say watching the video, it would be to learn about reading comprehension on the GMAT. So you have to consider this differentiation when you are addressing detail and purpose tasks in the GMAT reading comprehension. So let's take a look at our process for detail questions. First is going to be to identify the question task, as it is for all reading comprehension questions. You'll want to note key terms such as according to or in the passage that will indicate that this is a detail question task, and you'll then rephrase it in the form of a what style question. Secondly, you're going to want to read the prompt and note your relevant details. So you're going to use your specific term or location reference provided by the question, or potentially a highlight in the passage itself. The GMAT does potentially highlight a relevant term or phrase, so you just go to where they're pointing you to go. Then you have to read at least a sentence above and a sentence below the term or location reference to guarantee enough context. This is incredibly important. Don't just read the phrase including the term. Don't just read the one sentence that is referred to. Read at least a sentence above, a sentence below, and possibly more than that as required by the context of the passage. They love to put the actual answer just above or just below the sentence in question. Then you'll want to broadly predict what the answer should do by summarizing what the passage said as specifically as you can. So it's going to be a kind of balance. You don't want to get into like writing out every little detail, but in your mind you want to pretty directly note what they're talking about and how they are addressing whatever the question is. So why they introduce, or what they are talking about specifically about the term that is in question. And then for process of elimination, you want to focus on your incorrect actions and descriptions for objective reasons that 4 choices are definitively wrong. These will frequently, when dealing with detailed questions, involve reversals, things that are extreme based on the information, so go too far beyond the details that were discussed, or potentially include outside information that isn't mentioned in the passage. They really like to do this sort of thing where, for instance, they might be discussing the baking of bread and suddenly introduce the concept of flour. And flour may not be in the passage, so you can't know that flour is actually relevant to the baking of bread. So these are some common wrong answers. And when you're down to 2, remember to default to selecting the choice with a less absolute claim and fewer direct terms from the passage. In short, go with the blander option. So let's go ahead and take a look at our sample passage from an earlier lesson and talk about how to specifically address a detailed question. So on the left-hand side, you can see already highlighted where the information is. So we can see we've got, according to the passage, approaches used to choose possible government roles in public health can blank. So again, really just horrible phrasing, but we see the phrase according to the passage, and we're going to just rephrase this as a what question in our mind. We can do that by basically ignoring the phrase according to the passage and just rephrasing this as what can approaches used to choose possible government roles in public health do? Focus is what we need, and that drives me right back to the passage, and I know that I'm basically focused on this first paragraph here. And I may have to read a little bit more, may have to go through the paragraph to get specifically the details, and we're going to want to be careful as we go through these answer choices here to not assume that something is quote-unquote out of scope. We've got to make sure that it's there unless we can say that it's wrong for an action or description. So in the paragraph, we've got the public health and economic efficiency approaches to choosing a role for government often reach opposite conclusions. So because I'm talking about both approaches, I want to read until both of those approaches are done. From the public health perspective, the potential for illness or injury is sufficient to justify government action. Large numbers of deaths or illnesses are more compelling reasons for government action. The dollar value of benefits and costs derived from government programs does not necessarily enter the public health decision calculus. Alternatively, economic efficiency demands that proposed government programs clear 2 hurdles. First, there must be an efficiency program for government to solve. Second, a corrective program must be worth the cost. And you can just kind of glance at the second paragraph to see if it's relevant, and we see that now we're talking about economists have not reached a consensus on whether obesity raises economic efficiency problems. So we've changed subjects, and I'm only caring about those approaches that were introduced in the first sentence. So we know that there are different approaches, and they can sometimes reach opposite conclusions. And that's really what should be in our head as we work with our prediction as we go to these answer choices. It's pretty broad. Public health says death and illness is important, doesn't even care about dollar value, and economics, they demand to clear 2 hurdles. So, choice A, lobbying for a change, we don't actually see any lobbying occurring here, right? We don't know that these approaches actually do anything. We know for the public health perspective that it could be sufficient, but we don't know if the economic or public health approaches are going to take precedence. So that is going to be extreme because we don't actually have the action of lobbying. For choice B, we've got justify governmental action with economic evidence. And again, this is the bottom half of the paragraph, our second approach, and easily this portion of the paragraph could have been ignored if we did not note there were 2 approaches at the beginning, and we've got to read through at least both of those approaches. Now, as we go back, we see that economic efficiency demands that these programs clear 2 hurdles, but we don't know that any of these programs would actually clear these hurdles. So we can eliminate this because we don't know that the governmental action would actually be justified based on the evidence from the passage. Then choice C, examine possible causes for public weight issues. This is the wrong subject. We're not talking about the second paragraph. They do talk about possible causes, but we don't really have that being relevant to this task, the task of this question at all. For choice D, demanding that health concerns supersede economic consensus. Again, we've just got the 2 approaches. We don't know which one is actually going to be taken over the other. So saying that it supersedes economic consensus would once again be extreme. But consider variables impacting government decision making. Good and bland right there, and we're going to go ahead and select choice E, knowing that that is absolutely stated in that opening paragraph, and these other answer choices for various actions and descriptions are all definitively and provably wrong. Okay, so let's now take a look at the other question task that we're going to discuss in this lesson, the purpose question task. So we are going to have largely the same approach as the detail. We're going to start by identifying the question task, noting key terms such as primary, purpose, and the phrase in order to that will indicate a purpose question task, and then we're going to rephrase that question in the form of a why standard question so that it's easier for us to understand what we are supposed to do within the passage to address that task. Then, once again, you're going to read the prompt and note your relevant context. Use your term or location reference to target your reading. Remember that, again, you have to read at least a sentence above and a sentence below to guarantee proper context. And then, for the prediction, you want to specifically predict as best you can what the answer should do by considering the purpose of the information as it pertains to the context of the passage. So, what that means is think about the information and ask yourself, why did the author include it in the context of everything rather than just regurgitating what it literally said? Because we know that sometimes there will be just what answer traps here to why questions. And then lastly, once again, is going to be process of elimination. So focus on those incorrect actions and descriptions. For objective reasons, these 4 choices are definitively wrong. Once again, things like reversals, extremes, things that deal with the wrong subject matter, things that require outside knowledge, as we saw before. And force yourself to come up with something more than just, I don't like it or I didn't read it. Remember, with these specific detail or purpose questions, it may be just outside of where you read, and under the time constraints of the GMAT, it is quite possible that you just missed something. So do allow yourself to go back into the passage to read specifically when you're dealing with these specific purpose questions. And then, of course, when you're down to 2, default to selecting the choice with a less absolute claim and fewer direct terms from the passage. Go bland once again. So then we've got our same passage from before, and we see that there's a highlighted phrase as there might be on the actual exam, and we've got the question task of the purpose of the statement that economists have not reached a consensus is most likely to. So we can once again cross out some of these clumsy phrasings and just succinctly pose the question as, why mention that economists have not reached a consensus? So now we see the location highlighted on the left-hand side, and we know that we're going to have to go at least one sentence below. And so when you go one sentence below, you just kind of want to glance at the sentence after that, and you see on the other hand, and that means it's a contrast. So I'm not as concerned with that part of the paragraph when I'm trying to figure out why the author mentioned that economists have not reached a consensus. So then let's consider where we need to start our window. So obviously we need the second paragraph, but then we see second, a corrective program must be worth the cost. I don't know what came first. So first, okay, there must be an efficiency problem, but I don't know why we're talking about first. Then we've got alternatively, economic efficiency. Well, again, alternatively, I don't know what the alternative is. So we keep going up. We got the dollar value of benefits and costs derived from government programs does not necessarily enter the public health decision calculus. We might be able to stop here. But we remember from the first question that we were contrasting the public health perspective and the economic one. So we'll start reading from the public health perspective. So from the public health perspective, the potential for illness or injury is sufficient to justify government action. Large numbers of deaths or illnesses are more compelling reasons for government action. The dollar value of benefits and costs derived from government programs does not necessarily enter the public health decision calculus. Alternatively, economic efficiency demands that proposed government programs clear 2 hurdles. First, there must be an efficiency a problem for government to solve. Second, a corrective program must be worth the cost. So far, economists have not reached a consensus on whether obesity raises economic efficiency problems. If obesity results from informed individuals willingly making diet and lifestyle choices, there's no way to argue for inefficiency. It must be concluded that many are willing to accept extra weight because the cost of diet and exercise is too high. So we've got to think about, why did the author specifically call out that economists have not reached a consensus? Well, we know that throughout the passage there has been this discussion of the public health perspective versus the economic perspective. And we know that with public health, they basically say that illness, injury, potential is enough to justify government action. Large numbers of deaths are compelling, and we've got to act. They don't really care about the costs and benefits of the programs. It's just about helping people avoid illness and injury. The economists, though, they haven't reached a consensus, so they haven't decided whether these two hurdles will be cleared for this specific issue of obesity. So, now, if we're just looking at the choices, choice A, we are talking about a problem and we are introducing it, but we are not introducing a problem that the economists must solve. So while this is relevant to the paragraph, it is not why this specific subject matter has been presented in the passage. So this could qualify as a little bit of a what trap, because if you're like, there's a problem of obesity, you're not wrong, but it's not why the author mentioned that the economists have not reached a consensus. Then, choice B, qualify obesity as an insignificant health concern for the economy. Well, no, this is actually a reversal because they have not reached a consensus as yet regarding obesity and whether it raises economic efficiency problems. However, with choice C, provide contrast to a possible public health policy consensus. Well, we know that the public health people say that if there's illness or injury, that would be sufficient to justify government action. But the economists, they have not reached this consensus. So there is a contrast here, and that is why the economists, having not reached a consensus, is being mentioned in contrast to these public health perspectives who maybe have. So that matches our prediction. Then with choice D, we don't know that the argument is imminent for public health intervention because they haven't reached a consensus, so that would be a reversal. And there isn't any indication that they are hesitant to allocate public funds. This too would be extreme. They may allocate funds. We just don't know as yet. So this too could be eliminated, and we would select choice C as the reason, the purpose for the statement that was highlighted within the passage. So now we'll go over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more examples and how you will interact with them as you continue your practice on reading comprehension on the GMAT. Okay, so we see a different passage here about the Hubble Space Telescope, and we begin with this question about the author uses the phrase complete toolbox for astronomers most likely to. Now again, on the actual GMAT, this may be highlighted, but we also may need to skim for the phrase. But the first step is going to be, of course, to try to rephrase this as a what or a why question. So if we're being asked the author's use of something, that's why use the phrase complete toolbox for astronomers. And we can basically just ignore this most likely to part as being relatively irrelevant. So we'll go straight into the passage and seek that phrase of complete toolbox for astronomers. And we find it down here. So, right there. And we know we're going to need to read way more than just this phrase. So, we're going to go at least up to it, but well, I don't know what it is. And then I've got that instrumentation, well, I don't know what that instrumentation is. But here, we can finally start at each year. And remember, I'm going to want to go a little bit further down in the passage as well, so my window will be a little bit broad, but it's better to be broad up front rather than missing something. So we'll read this window. Each year, an announcement goes out to the worldwide community soliciting research proposals for use of Hubble and its instrumentation. That instrumentation is a complementary set of cameras, spectrographs, and other more specialized devices, such as stellar coronagraphs and interferometers. It is extremely versatile and covers a wide range of performance characteristics such as sensitivity, resolution, and wavelength coverage. Taken together, the Hubble instruments provide essentially a complete toolbox for astronomers to utilize in attacking almost any problem in modern optical astronomy. Hubble observations have yielded major advances in virtually every area of astronomy and astrophysics. So, why is the Hubble called a complete toolbox for astronomers, we can just have a real broad prediction for yourself here and just say, to summarize its uses. So just to show, it can do all of these things and more, basically. So choice A could be a trap. We do end up talking in the next paragraph about the availability of the Hubble Space Telescope, but that is not why the complete toolbox for astronomers is mentioned. So this would be the wrong subject matter. Now, the next answer choice, there may be a word that you're not familiar with. If you're not familiar with the word manifest, put a question mark next to this, because that is part of where they're generating the difficulty. Just using a strange term for something that could have just been stated as all of the abilities, as opposed to showcase the manifest abilities of a resource. But if you know that manifest means all, great number, then this matches our prediction quite nicely. Again, we're not soliciting interest at this point about the newly launched solution. We also don't know that it's newly launched here at this point. Maybe it was, but it's not been stated for certain, so this is something that would qualify as extreme and therefore can be eliminated. Hype the successes of a research method. Again, we're not talking about the successes. That is not why they're talking about it as a complete toolbox for astronomers. It is to just say that it can do all of these different things. So that, again, is just not the purpose. So not a match. And demand credit for an underappreciated scientific field. That is rather extreme again, and just an action that's not supported. So we'll just call that out as extreme and confidently select choice B. So then we move to the second of the two questions, and this time we've got in the passage, which already as a phrase just tells me that this is probably a what question. So, in the passage, the community of researchers interested in using the Hubble Space Telescope is described as. So, what describes? Oops. So, what describes the community of researchers interested in using the Hubble Space Telescope? And again, we can just eliminate this clunky phrasing, and we've got a much nicer, simple question to answer. So I've got to go find the researchers that are interested in using the telescope. And we find more about the interest in the second paragraph. And the good thing about a potential piecemeal as you go reading approach to this passage and these questions, if, say, the purpose question above was the first question, is that I don't necessarily need to reread to know that the second paragraph is going to be more about the community of researchers. So we just keep going from where we were. So the mechanism by which this is achieved is the open proposal solicitation, peer review, and selection process that brings into the Hubble Research Program, and there's our rough approximation of the term, because again, they don't have to give you the exact term, you kind of have to look for it. So this open proposal solicitation, peer review, and selection process that brings into the Hubble Research Program observers from the entire international astronomical community. The demand for Hubble observing times is huge. In a typical proposal cycle, approximately 5 or 6 times as much observing time is requested as is available. Many extremely worthy research proposals are rejected each cycle simply because there's not nearly enough time on the telescope to go around. And I'm kind of just talking about the research at this point. So my prediction here would be something to the effect of, we know it's international. And there's more interest than availability. So then we just go to our answer choices again, contrasting against our broad prediction that we've got written out. So the community is tremendously successful. Well, again, that seems like something that would be reasonable, but that will require outside knowledge. We know that the observations have yielded major advances before, but we don't know that the community of researchers is necessarily tremendously successful. So that's extreme and just not supported by the passage. Now, global in its scope. Well, this global in its scope definitely matches international. Now, always check all five choices just to make certain, but this seems like a pretty good match at this point. Extremely complimentary. Here, they're just hoping that you might have remembered the word complementary from up here. So this is just recycled language. So this is just reused terms, which is another thing that they do like to use as a trap answer. Essential to modern astronomy. Again, we were talking about modern optical astronomy before, but that is not about the astronomical community of researchers. So that's extreme again. And while it is known to generate more interest than they have time available to fulfill, we don't know that the community of researchers interested in using the Hubble Space Telescope is larger than most other scientific communities. That goes outside of the scope again, and we can't make that assertion based solely on the information in our passage. So this is a good summary of how to address the most common question tasks on GMAT reading comprehension, our purpose and detail questions. Go ahead and conduct some practice on your own to improve your own skill set in addressing these questions.